Good morning. Vern told me I could make a joke about them leaving, but, I'm going to say something typical like, oh, must be my preaching, I got to do better. And, maybe I really do. But, we're praying that they make it there safely and that everything goes well with Doug. These last few weeks, we've been looking at the story. It's a book, it's the Bible formatted like a novel, and it focuses on the story of God redeeming humanity. The story of God specifically and his plan of salvation. And that is what the Bible is. It is the story of God and of what God is doing. It is God's story. And the Bible is actually something that's really cool. And we talked about this last week, Sunday night. The Bible is a story full of stories. It is a story of stories. They have a word for that now, and it's called meta-narrative. God's plan of salvation and redemption for his creation is this big overarching story. But that story is full of other stories. Meta-narrative. Now I know, and I myself have felt this way before too, I know sometimes we don't like using the word story when we talk about the Bible. We have this almost instinctive response because we tend to think of stories as something made up, right? But that's not always the case. And people haven't always thought that way about stories. For a large portion of human history, stories were the preferred method of teaching. And Jesus teaches with stories all the time. That's what parables are. And the Bible is a story of stories that teach God's truth. And the best part, they're all true stories. And when you think of the Bible as a story that teaches, when you think of it as the story, instead of just a list of do's and don'ts, it really starts to come alive. A good story told right can be exciting, motivating, life-changing. And you know what? God is a master storyteller. I have a question for you. What makes a good story? Plot, yeah. Characters, yeah. Yeah. Action, yeah. Action, suspense, intrigue, plot, characters. Some romance. The Bible has all of that. It's got a huge plot that spans a couple thousand years. Not many stories do that. And it's got subplots, and it's, we have the amazing story of how God created everything. We have the story of this terrifying global flood and how God rescues one family. We have a story of one man being called on an amazing adventure and eventually becoming an entire nation. We have stories in here of people wrestling with God, a mass escape from slavery as God helps them and utterly destroys their masters. And last week, this was one of my favorite books as a kid. Last week we looked at Judges. If you're a teenage boy, that is a book for you. It is full of action and intrigue. You get a spy sneaking into the palace and assassinating a king and then sneaking out before he's caught. I mean, multiple times you see a single person taking on hundreds of people in combat and winning, all because of God. And last week, we saw Gideon. We saw God use Gideon and 300 men to take down tens of thousands of people. I mean, what amazing stories. True stories. And so following the book of Judges, we now have what's really a romance story. You know, the Bible has it all. God includes some romance in here that takes place during the time of Judges. The book of Ruth follows two women who will have significant roles in God's plans, in His story. The women's names are Naomi and Ruth. Now, at the beginning, the focus is really on Naomi. Some have argued you could almost call the book Naomi, because it starts and ends with some stuff about her. But it also focuses on Ruth, so it's really quite cool and intricate. So, because of famine, Naomi and her family go to Moab. Her husband's name is Elimelech. And they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. You know, and it's kind of a tragedy to start, you know. First her husband dies, and then after marrying these Moabite women, something that was usually frowned on, both her sons die. And so now Naomi lives in this foreign land in Moab with her two daughter-in-laws for 10 years. And then she decides to return to Bethlehem. And we, you know, for opening chapter, there's this discussion, this back and forth, where she tries to encourage her two daughter-in-laws to go back to their families. You know, she says, I don't have any more sons for you to marry. I can't provide for you. Go back to your families. Orpah leaves. And we could say some things about that, but maybe we shouldn't judge her too harshly. Ruth, however, stays. Ruth actually goes and makes quite the promise to Naomi. In Ruth chapter 1, the second half of verse 16 to verse 17, she says, For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people, your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. I mean, talk about an oath, a pledge. Talk about loyalty. I mean, I love my in-laws, but if my family died, I probably wouldn't be making that kind of promise to my in-laws. It's like, Ruth already shows herself to be someone special. She is very clear, I am not leaving you. And she is willing to leave her own country, her own people, when really she has no basis for thinking that God is going to look after her there. But she still trusts it and chooses to go with Naomi. And so then we read about Naomi and Ruth returning to Bethlehem. They travel to Bethlehem, and the Bible tells us, you know, the whole town gets all excited, all stirred up. And all the women are like, is this Naomi? This small town, the gossip, hey, that woman's returned. And her husband and her sons aren't with her. But she brought this foreign woman. What's going on? Everyone's interested, right? And then Naomi shows us that she's actually having a really hard time with her loss. She even goes so far as to wanting to change her name. In Ruth 1:20, she replies to these women and says, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Mara literally means bitter. And Naomi thinks that it is a more fitting name for her than the one she has, which means pleasant. You know, this isn't uncommon. We see cases in the Old Testament of names being changed to better reflect a person's circumstances. And so Naomi wants to change her name because she thinks this suits her circumstances better. But right here in the very beginning, before anything happens, we actually have this clue that God is not done dealing with Naomi. Because despite her request, the book never refers to her as Mara. The author and God disagree. God did not deal bitterly with her. The story is not over. You have to wait till the end. Her tragedy is actually part of a larger series of events that will result in God's blessing. You know, that alone right there is such a good lesson for us today. A hard lesson, but a good one, right? Whatever tragedies are going on in your life could be part of a series of events that are going to result in God's blessing. You know, we just heard about Vern and Margaret having to leave to help with their son-in-law and their family and their struggles going on there. And we have no idea what's going to happen. But man, do we hope and pray that those tragedies are a series of events that are going to end in God's blessing. Right? And I pray that for anyone experiencing difficulty. And so now we go back to the story and we see it transitioning from focusing on Naomi to focusing on Ruth, just for a little bit. We're told that the women arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, and that Naomi has a relative of her husband's named Boaz. It's like the author's saying, you know, Boaz is going to come up. Keep an eye out for this guy. He's special. Something important is going to go on here. So then we have the story of Ruth meeting Boaz. You know, as widows, Ruth and Naomi have no way to provide for themselves. So Ruth decides to go out and do something called gleaning. She picks up the grain, the barley, whatever that's left in the field that has fallen. See, according to Mosaic law, harvesters are meant to leave anything that falls on the ground while they're harvesting, or any sheaves or bundles that they forget are to be left behind, so for the widows, orphans, and sojourners, also known as, refugees and immigrants. So when reading Ruth, we actually still need to see this sort of subtext, this subplot about the concern of God and His law for needy people. Today we assume everything needs to be done with just maximum efficiency, right? Can't have any waste, time, product, whatever. But God, He actually told His people, when you're harvesting your fields, don't be too efficient. Actually, be kind of inefficient. Leave something behind for the people who have no way of ensuring that they'll have food for themselves. And that is an underlying story within the story of Ruth. God cares for the needy. And so now the text tells us that Ruth, she goes out to do this, to glean. And she just happens to come across the field Boaz owns. I mean, talk about a coincidence, right? maybe a divine coincidence, an orchestrated coincidence. And so now we're introduced to the man Boaz in Ruth chapter 2. We read in verse 4, it says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.'" This is actually an interesting kind of greeting. You know, it could be a typical greeting between people at the time in Bethlehem, but it actually seems far more likely, especially in the time of Judges, when we know a lot of people weren't all that faithful to God, that it's actually an indication of Boaz's relationship with God and his good relationship with his employees. You know, he blesses them and they bless him in return. And so right off the bat, first time we meet Boaz, we see this guy's different. Let's keep an eye on him. And so Boaz starts to ask about, that foreign woman out in the field, gleaning. And his men tell him that this is Ruth. She's a foreign woman. She's a Moabite. And she actually came along asking for permission to do what she's legally allowed to do. She asks for permission to glean, when everybody knows by law she's allowed. And we're told she worked really, really hard. From morning until the time Boaz showed up, not even really taking many breaks or anything. She's hard working. And so Boaz goes and talks to her. In chapter 2, verse 8, we read, "Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women.'" First of all, Boaz calls her my daughter. And that likely does reflect their age difference. We find out a little bit later that he's probably a fair bit older than her. But it's also actually a very affectionate term to use on a foreigner. Right? He's being very warm with her. And then he proceeds to tell her, "Only glean in my fields." He has made sure that no young men are going to bother her, like they might if she goes to another person's field. And he's also making sure that his men will take time out of their work and provide water for her. He is taking care of her. And then we have this whole encounter in Judges 2, 10 through 12, where Ruth, she falls down and she's like, "Why are you being so good to me?" Well, Boaz says, "I know all about you already. I know what you did for your mother-in-law." And he's also being nice because he says he knows she has sought refuge with Yahweh. Ruth 2:12, he says, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz recognizes that, she has expressed loyalty to Yahweh. In his eyes, she is officially a resident of their land. She is under Yahweh's protection. He actually uses a common phrase that the Israelites use about finding shelter under God's wings. And it's meant to conjure up images and compare God's tender love and care for his people to the way a bird pulls her young under her wing and protects and cares for them. And there's some interesting stuff going on with that word there too. Because the word translated wings can also mean skirt or edge of your garment. And I want you to keep that in mind because it's going to come up later. And it's going to be pretty neat the way it works. So Boaz says, I know you've sought shelter with God, and I know you're taking care of your mother-in-law. So I'm going to help you. And then when mealtime comes, Boaz actually invites Ruth to eat with him. So in the ancient Near East, allowing someone to eat at your table was a way of showing respect. And let's be honest, most Jewish people would not be welcoming foreigners to their table. On top of that, Boaz himself serves her. You know, she's sitting with him. He's like, take your bread, dip it in the wine or the vinegar. And he serves her. That is a type of respect reserved for special guests. Boaz is just going so far above and beyond what the law requires of him. And then Boaz, he actually instructs his men in secret. He says, leave a little extra for Ruth. Actually, pull some out of what you've harvested and drop it on the ground, Don't let her know, but here. Ruth 2:17 tells us that Ruth manages to gather a whole ephah. That is about 22 liters or 30 pounds of barley. I mean, that's a lot of barley. Ruth ends up with enough food to feed her and Naomi for several weeks. Really. And this is obviously quite a bit more than you would normally expect. Because, Ruth comes home and Naomi's kind of curious. She's like, where did you glean today? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. This is a lot. Something's going on here. And then in Ruth 2:20, she tells Naomi that, it was the man Boaz. And then Naomi says, Boaz, he's actually a close relative. And he's one of our redeemers. Now, this is a phrase that really the whole book of Ruth just kind of hinges on. The word for redeemer is goel. And there are actually 3 ways to translate that word. It could be guardian, redeemer, and restorer. And what's neat is all 3 ways of translating that word convey something of what it means. It refers to a person outside of your immediate family or your household. So Ruth and Naomi are a household. But that's their immediate family. But within your extended family are some close relatives by birth. And among them, you might be lucky enough that there's a head of another household that's better off than yours. So that would be Boaz. He's a close relative in the extended family and the head of another household that's doing a lot better. That person is called a near kinsman, a potential guardian of your freedom, a potential redeemer who could use some of their resources to get you out of trouble. According to the law, the closest redeemer, the closest kinsman, had certain responsibilities. According to Leviticus 25:25, that could be buying back family land that you had to sell. Or according to Leviticus 25:47 through 49, it could be buying back a family member who had to sell themselves into indentured slavery to pay some debts. Or, according to Deuteronomy 25, it could mean marrying the childless widow of a family member. That always sounded kind of weird to me. I don't know about you. Why that rule, especially marrying a childless widow? Why is that kind of thing important? Well, Israel's land was distributed among clans and the families as a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and then to his descendants. See, the land was directly under control of the male head of each family. And to maintain that system and avoid land becoming the property of these big landowners, land had to stay under the control of the family it was given to. And so the laws about redeemers ensured that the land stayed in the family and that there was always an heir to that family to carry it on and to hold on to the land. And so it really appears as though Elimelech and Naomi, at the very beginning of the book, had to give over their land to someone because of the famine 10 years ago. And now, with no heirs, Naomi and Ruth have no way of claiming it back. And they have no means to do so anyway. They're poor. They need a redeemer. And so Ruth comes up with this plan. Naomi and Ruth in chapter 3. In verses 1 through 4, it reads, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do.'" You know, the fields where they plant crops are outside of the city. And so are the threshing floors. And you know, farmers didn't have pickup trucks back then, right? So it could have been up to an hour or two commute by walking. And so workers would sometimes camp out in the fields. And on top of that, camping out also meant you could make sure no one stole your barley overnight. So Boaz sleeps next to his big heap of barley. And then we come to Naomi's instructions to Ruth. And, you know, there's a lot going on there. She says, "Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your cloak." This section has caused some people some serious misunderstanding. Right? So washing your entire body like that and anointing yourself, that could be done in preparation for an important event. You think of it like you're getting all dolled up for this important occasion, right? And dressing the way Ruth does could be understood as one of two things. You know, preparation for marriage, making yourself look like a bride, or preparation for a sexual encounter, trying to appear seductive. And so then, on top of that, Ruth is told, sneak down at night when Boaz is asleep and uncover his feet and lie down. And this section, you know, it adds even more to the confusion for some people. And we're gonna get into that a little bit. You know, uncovering someone's nakedness sometimes was a euphemism for having sex. You know, we see that in Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 22. And the word foot was sometimes used as a euphemism for genitals. And the term lie down is also often used as a euphemism for having sex. So there's a lot of people have seen these occasions, and they start to debate, and they think, well, did Naomi tell her to go seduce Boaz? The truth is, the wordplay here actually seems a lot more like a literary device, It's used to create this sense of nervous anticipation. What's going to happen? What's a good story without some suspense, right? It makes it appear as though Naomi is sending Ruth off to seduce Boaz. But we know that seems seriously out of character for her after she shows such concern for Ruth's well-being. And sex seems unlikely since Ruth and Boaz this whole time are portrayed as virtuous and blessed by Yahweh. It would be extremely out of character. Naomi here she's trusting that Boaz is going to act with integrity and be the man she thinks he is. Because, Ruth is placing herself in a pretty vulnerable situation. She is staying alone with a powerful man. And truthfully, you could hardly blame a man who's woken up in the middle of the night to find a woman laying next to him for maybe thinking that she's offering herself to him. But if Boaz doesn't take advantage of Ruth, then he truly is a worthy man, as we've been led to suspect. And so we're told Ruth does exactly what Naomi suggests. She gets all dressed up and she heads out to the threshing floor. She waits for Boaz to finish eating and drinking and go to sleep, and then she goes and quietly uncovers his feet and lies down. And then Boaz wakes up, and Ruth 3:9, he says, "Who are you?" It's probably pretty dark, right? And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant. You are a redeemer." So rather than a seduction, what we have here is a marriage proposal. Okay? Remember that phrase I told you to keep an eye out for? Under your wings? Ruth uses that language that is often used for finding care and protection with Yahweh. Spread your wings over your servant. But there's a play on words. Because as I mentioned, that word can also mean your skirt or the corner of your garment. And the custom in these times was if you placing the edge of a garment over a woman symbolized taking her into marriage. And we see that in Ezekiel 16:8, a mention of that. So what's really happening here is Ruth is like, "It's me, Ruth. Spread your wings, your garment over me. Marry me. You're my redeemer." And Ruth does remind Boaz of his legal obligation. You're my redeemer. But, the fact that she makes herself look beautiful, making these preparations one would do to get married, to look like a beautiful bride, it really shows she's appealing to more than just his sense of moral and social obligation. Right? She wants him to be attracted to her as well. Let's have a little romance, right? What bride doesn't want to be attractive? And so you know what? Boaz accepts her, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to try and speed through a little bit. I've talked too much. Maybe that's why Vernon and Margaret really left, eh? So Boaz accepts. But he says, there's someone closer, and we need to deal with that. There's someone else who has rights to redeem before I do. And so she spends the night at his feet instead of beside him, Above reproach, right? You lay at his feet instead of beside him under the blankets, it doesn't look like you did anything. So then Boaz says, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he sends her off with some food and stuff, and he could be talking to Ruth specifically, or because of the wording, the woman, there's a good chance he's telling any workers that have shown up, keep this secret, right? Protect our reputations. especially hers. So then he sends her home. And in chapter 4, we read about Boaz's interaction with this closer kinsman. And Boaz is pretty clever. He talks about the land first, and then he mentions, oh yeah, Ruth comes with this. And so the other man decides he doesn't want to be the redeemer. And typically in the Old Testament, they were shamed for that, for not doing their duty. But we don't see that here. There's no spitting in his face like the law requires or anything like that. Because the focus is here on Boaz, who he wants to be the redeemer. And so he takes responsibility, and they follow all the legal customs of the time, and they make it all super official. Boaz and Ruth get married. They have a child named Obed. And here we see, back to Naomi's story, God has continued to work in her life and made sure that Naomi was provided for and that he did not deal bitterly with her. And now her family has an heir. The family name will continue. The land will stay where it's supposed to. On top of that, it tells us Obed is the future King David's grandfather. So now, Naomi and Ruth are ancestors of King David and eventually Jesus the Messiah. Talk about blessing from tragedy. And the connection to Jesus is really cool because it goes beyond just genealogy. Boaz and Ruth are what we call types. A type is a person that symbolizes or exemplifies characteristics of someone or something else. Boaz is very much a type of Christ. He is symbolic of Jesus, and Ruth in many ways of all Gentiles, all people outside God's family. Boaz shares a meal with Ruth, a foreign woman, showing great respect, something many Jewish people would not have done. Jesus shared meals with sinners, people that Jewish people would have avoided, showing them love and respect. And then Boaz redeems Ruth. She's a widow stuck in poverty, and he brings her into his family. Jesus is our close kinsman, and he redeems us. We were stuck in poverty, in sin, outside of the family of God. And Jesus rescues us. He redeems us from that sorry state and restores us, bringing us into his family. And now, just like Ruth, we are part of a royal bloodline. I gotta cut this short. There's so much in this book. But, we are part of this royal bloodline, and now we are representatives of that, of Jesus. And in many ways, that turns us into a type, like Boaz. A type is a person who exemplifies or symbolizes someone else. We are now types of Jesus. So, here's a question. Do you exemplify Jesus to the world? Do you show concern for the needy? And I don't just mean saying, hey, I'm concerned for the needy. I mean in your actions. Do you associate with people and show respect to the undesirables, so to speak? Do you show hospitality to foreigners? Yes, actual foreigners to our country, but foreigners to God. Do you offer the redemption of Christ to those who need it? Are we like Boaz? Are we types of Christ? We sure should be. And this story, I think, is so beautiful. Right? Like, we see that God has actually always planned to include everyone who's willing. You know, we saw in Joshua, he brings in Rahab, a foreigner, into the royal bloodline. And now he brings Ruth, a foreigner, into the royal bloodline. God, it's not just the New Testament. God always wanted to be the God of everyone, of anyone who comes to him. And that's what the story's driving towards. You know, what God was doing in establishing Israel. He's making this people that he's going to send his son through. He's driving towards redemption for everyone who is willing. I mean, what an amazing story. It's our love story, right? Everybody loves a good love story. And this one is the best. Ruth is a mini love story within a bigger love story. Everybody loves a little romance, so why not share the greatest love story ever told with those around you?